Hey everybody, welcome to the tutorial. I'm going to do a tutorial today on MSO 2.0. Going to be using an example from my house with three subwoofers. Two of them are sealed and one is a bass reflex. So it'll give you a good example of some more complex maximization using phase control. Okay, so we'll just jump right in. So I'm going to cover a few things. First, I'll do a quick intro. Then I'm going to spend a bit of time doing a basic setup of MSO. So I like to have my MSO screen set up a certain way so I can really understand what's going on, how the screens are laid out, how the phase plots are there, which measurements to include, etc. Then we're going to jump into a multi-stage optimization. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it step by step. I'm going to pause as I go through each one to really try to explain exactly what it's trying to do and how you can tweak it as you go. Then we'll review the results and we'll iterate as it makes sense to do so. Okay, so without further ado, I'll do a quick intro here. So with I don't want to do one of these videos without making a huge thanks to Andy C. This is an amazing piece of software. I think many of us are just blown away by how well it works. So thank you, Andy. And then also, just for those of you who have not discovered Jeff for Fat Tires videos on YouTube, make sure you watch those as well. Those will give you a good intro in terms of how to set up, how to do some recording, how to load your data into MSO. Okay, I'm not going to be showing the process to set up and record using Ruby Wizard and or to bring into MSO. I'll be focusing more on running MSO and how to optimize your solution. Okay, so let me just give you a quick example of what the setup is going to look like, and then I'll jump into MSO and we'll get started. So first of all, this is the setup in my basement actually. So I've got three subwoofers. Two of them are sealed. They're on the front wall, and I've got one bass reflex subwoofer right behind the couch there. Minor typo. It's an open concept, so I have some interesting peaks at very, very, very low frequencies because the basement's open to the house. So there's some interesting outputs there. Okay, and this is a pretty common setup for many people with two subs on the front, one either right behind the couch. Sometimes people put them back corners, that's fine, or along the wall. This is a very normal setup, and so this hopefully will help some of you figure out how to get yours working. Okay, so let's flip into MSO now, and we'll start here on this screen. So right now I've started with a basic screen, a basic setup. So I have loaded in the three subs that I've got, and this is right after I've done the wizard for the three subs. So you can see I have 5 listening positions, my left seat, my main listening position, my right seat, and then I've got a left mid and a right mid seat, okay, up here. And this is just the default outputs from MSO. You can also see over here on the left, I've got a back center sub, my front left sub, and my front right sub, and my baseline configuration. So I'm going to go through step by step kind of what I do when I first start this, because I like to have it set up a little differently than MSO defaults do. So first of all, I just rename this one to just baseline, okay? Just keeps it simple. You want to have a baseline reference that's not got any filters on it whatsoever. So I actually like to just delete all the filters that are on it. Okay, so I'm just hitting the delete button to just get rid of any filters that are on the subs and any shared filters. Next thing I do, it's pretty picky, but I like to rename the graph as well. So if you click down here on the data view, click on this, right click, and you can rename. And I just call this baseline as well, just to keep things simple. And then also I right click on the graph and I just label this graph as baseline. Okay, it keeps things organized. And what I like to do is get the baseline exactly the way I like it, and then every time I clone that, all the settings will move into the next optimization charts. Okay, so now I've got the graph set up. So the next step I do is I adjust a few things on the various settings here. So on the axes, I like to typically go from 10 hertz to 200, there's 300 to see what's really happening. You can see that change. Leave it as log. And then I like to have the vertical y-axis set at about 60 dB from the bottom to the top. So in my case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to, you can see the upper end is near 100. So I'm going to go 110 and make this 50, okay, and turn that on so you can actually force it to have nice separation between these. Okay, so 50 to 110. And then I'll show you the reason why here, but on the phase plots, I also want to set these to minus 360 and 1800 and set this to 180 degrees. I'll show you why that works well in a second. Okay, so once again, 60 dB separation between these, and then use these settings here. In your case, you might want to play around a little bit with the upper and lower values depending on what you recorded at. Okay, so on the all traces here, so I'm going to turn this on choose for each trace and choose for each trace to give myself control. And I'll hit apply. Okay, I'm going to do one more thing here. Oops, I'm going to do one more thing on this one. I'm going to just see where my natural response is. So I'm going to turn on my natural response for the main listening position. Okay, I only need to see that one. Okay, so in my case, you can see it's actually this gray line here. So this is a pretty good setting. I might actually change this to 105 axes, 105, and 45. Okay, so I want the top of the curve here to be near the top of the screen to give a bit of room. Okay, so the next thing I do is I change the colors of these on here. So I have a standard color scheme that I like to use. So I like to have my left seat as black, my right seat as red, just like the patch cords and old RCA connections. I'll put my left middle as gray, so it's sort of the same color, and the right one is magenta. And then the main listening position I'll leave as, I'll turn to blue, and I like to make the MLP a little thicker so I can really see what's going on. The other thing I'll do is I'll check the natural response, and you can pick a different color, but it's helpful to have that, especially for the first few steps I'll show you in a minute here, to have this as a highly contrasting color so you can really see what's going on. So I'll just make it green so we can easily see what's happening. Okay, so now we have our seats, and now you can see what's happening here. So I've got my blue as my main listening position. So that's my response before I do any correction whatsoever. And you can see that I've got a big dip here at the mid-bass frequencies, sort of in the 45 to 65 hertz range, which is right where the kick drums are and stuff like that. So we definitely want to fix that. The other thing you'll see is the natural response, for those who are not familiar, is the curve that is the maximum possible output from your particular subwoofer configuration. So in my case, I've got the 3 subs. If they were to add together perfectly, so everything was perfectly in phase at all seats, or sorry, at the main listening position at the same time for all frequencies, this is the maximum output I could get from this. So this is an important reference. So you can never get any louder than this. So what we're trying to do as we do our optimizations is to get this blue curve to be as close to this green curve as possible. Okay. So let's come back to that in a few minutes. Next thing I'll do is I'll turn on the other things that I'd like to have available in my views. So the first thing I want to see is I want to have my filter channels. Now we won't see those for a few minutes, but I'm going to turn on the filter channels for the input and output for my 3 subs. So the filter channel for input output for back center, for front left, and for front right. Okay, just turn that, hit apply, and that's turned them on. You don't see anything quite yet. I'll show you in a second why. The next thing I want to see is I want the filtered measurements. Now this is really important. Most people don't do this, but what I really want to see is the phase of my filtered measurements. So I'm going to turn on the main listening position measurement for the back center sub, the MLP, so the MLP right here for the front left sub, and the MLP for the front right sub. So you should have 3 for the 3 subs. Okay, turn that on. Now what that's going to do is it's going to turn on the amplitude response. So you can see this is the actual measurements at the main listening positions for each of those subwoofers after all filters have been applied. Now I haven't applied any filters yet, so it's the actual measurements, but you'll see this will be very useful in a few minutes. But I don't really care about the amplitude response for this. What I really care about is the phase response. So I'm going to go into my trace properties, and those 3 that I just turned on are these filtered measurements one. And I'm going to change this to show phase, okay? And you'll see that in a second. Now, okay, so that just turned on these phase plots down here. these are really, really useful to see what's happening to make sure you're not doing something really stupid to your setup. And you can also really see how well your subs are playing with each other. And now what you can also see is the reason I picked those phase numbers in that graph setup is that to be spaced like this is it gives you a nice little perfectly lined up with the amplitude over here. Okay, so I have this nice phase plot down here. I just leave that right there. Okay, and I also like it wrapped because it just fits on the screen a lot better. Okay, so we'll keep going. A couple more things we want to do here. So I've done the measurements leave off, filter channels, I've done 3 there, filtered measurements we just turn on. Measurement groups are always defaulted on, so just leave them on, that's the normal way. I turned on the natural response earlier, but if you forgot to do that, just turn it on here. And then the target curve, just turn that on, and that's the target that you're going to be targeting towards, okay? And then the last step I'll do is just change the colors. I like to have things color coded so I know what's right, what's left, what's front, what's back. I find that's very helpful when you're trying to tweak and tune and compare different things. So the last step I'll do is for my filtered channels, my front left I'll make black, my front right I'll make red, and my back center I'll make blue. Just leave it as blue. Okay, we'll see those in a few minutes. My back center, same thing. I'll make the this is my phase plot, so I'm adjusting here. My front left, I'll make black. My front right, I'll make red. Okay, and I think that's it for now. Okay. All right, so what have we got here? So we now have a really good starting place to understand what's going on with my setup. So as I mentioned before, you can see that the blue line here is substantially below the green line. So what's causing that? Well, what's causing that line to be below is that the 3 subwoofers are not in phase with each other at the listening position. So that means the peak and the troughs are not lined up with each other. So you remember from high school physics, when you add waves together, if you have peak to peak and trough to trough, the waves actually double in size, double in height. You have 2 waves of the same height. If you have peak to trough and trough to peak, you actually get wave cancellation. You get something that looks like this area right here where there's absolutely no sound. And that's exactly what you will hear. You will not hear any sound at 51 hertz or whatever that number is. And the nice thing about having the phase plots in here is you can actually look at them and inspect and predict what's going to happen. So let's start right here. So right here, all 3 of these lines of the phase plots are on top of each other. So that means that all 3 subs are perfectly in phase at this frequency. So this frequency is, I can just turn that data cursor on. That frequency is 27.2 hertz. And you can see right here at the top, the blue line is right on top of the green line. That's exactly where you would expect it to see, okay? Whereas here, what's happening is the blue line, the black line, and the red line are not on top of each other. In fact, if they are out of phase by exactly 180 degrees, okay, so each one of these distances is 180 degrees, you can sort of eyeball it, then that is when you get perfect phase cancellation. And then there are other places where it's sort of in between. Okay, so down here you can see 2 of the subs, the black one and the blue one. So the blue one is my back center sub, the black one is my front left sub. They're in phase with each other, but the 2 of them are slightly out of phase with the red one, which is the front right sub. Okay, and as a result, I've lost about what looks like maybe 3, maybe 4 decibels of output in this area. Now 3 or 4 dB may not sound like a lot, but it takes a doubling of amplifier power to get 3 dB more, okay? And 6 dB is basically doubling the volume. So every decibel matters because this is logarithmic in terms of its height. Okay, so, and then just one last thing just before we move on is for those of you who are not that familiar with phase, it's kind of a complex thing to explain in a tutorial like this, but basically it's a representation of how delayed the signal is over time relative to a reference, okay? And for our purposes, our goal here is to basically make all of these phase lines look more or less on top of each other, okay? And you'll see in a few minutes as we run some optimizations that there's also kind of a nice seesaw or zigzag pattern that you get with wrapped phase, sort of well-behaved wrapped phase, that is what you're ideally looking for. Okay, so that's step number one. We've got our baseline set up. One last thing I'm going to do here, and then we'll move on to our first optimization step. I'm going to look at the target curve line. So you can see it was just set at default to 75 hertz. Now, one of the nice things also of using the natural response curve, as you can see here, is if I get all my subs working well together, I should be able to get my main listening position to be pretty close to that green line. And so what you can use is you can use this natural response curve here as a reference to set my target. So you typically will want to set it somewhere near the bottom of the lowest part of this response curve, between somewhere around 10 or 20, depending on the power of your sub, somewhere in that range, to up to about 200 or so. All right. And remember, I've got mine plotted to 300, so I'm really only caring about here. So I've got it to 75. It's actually not a bad spot right where it is, but what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, I like to have it sort of halfway between the multiples of 5, just to make it a little simpler. So what I'm going to do, oops, I got to go back to my config view. I'll go into the baseline and go into optimization options. I'll change this, and I'll change this to 77.5. Okay, so now I'm going to target this line, and then in a few minutes I'll show you how you put a little bit of variability in there and let MSO find the precise final target that it's going to land on. Okay, so what you can see here is, for the most part, this target line, I'm just going to change that color to make it a bit more obvious. Trace properties, target, just turn that to black, make it a little thicker. Okay, so MSO is going to try to get the response to land right on that line in a perfect scenario. Okay, and for the most part, because I like to use only negative PEQs, I always want to have the line slightly or near the bottom of this. Okay, so that looks good. It's slightly below the bottom area right about here, so we're good. Okay, we've got enough room to put in the PEQs. Okay, so now that I've got that established, the last thing I'll do here is I'm going to go into the trace properties, and I haven't talked about the filter channels yet. You'll see that once we get the PEQ filters on in a few minutes. This is a very handy thing to see what's happening as well in terms of your filter channels. So what's also useful is knowing how much filtering you're doing relative to your sort of standard unfiltered PEQ situation. So what I like to do is just set this magnitude display to be the same as this number here. So I just set it to 77.5. So I'll set it to 77.5. I'm just going to copy that and paste it into here. Okay. Now you didn't see anything happen because we haven't got any optimizations to run, but you'll see that in a few minutes when I do an optimization. Okay, now I'm going to do a save as, save it as 1C here, just to not mess up with my original file. Okay, all right, so we're ready to go. We have a good baseline. So I'm going to clone the baseline and create my first configuration. I'll just leave it as default config 2. You can rename it right here if you want to. I can see lots of people use different naming conventions. So a couple steps. As soon as you clone the config, creates another config. It also creates a new chart, but it doesn't show the graph right away. So you need to go back over here to data view, and you can right click on that and hit show. Okay. And you can also rename it here. I'll just leave it as default. And the next thing I always do is I just go into graph properties and just name this something config 2. And I typically put my my first step here, which is we're going to max the sound pressure, SPL. Okay, there we go, max SPL. Okay, so I'm going to hide the baseline for now, open up config 2 so I don't mess things up. I've done that quite a few times. I put the filters in the wrong optimization run and then realized it later. No big deal. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do now is we're going to try to set delays, see if we can get a nice response and fix this big gap here and maybe get a bit of this area here fixed just by putting in delays onto some of my subs. Okay, so MSO can do all this in one step, but I want it for the purpose of this tutorial, but also I kind of like to do this myself. I like to see what's actually happening. So I'm going to add a delay block to 2 out of the 3 subs. Okay, so here we go. There's one delay block. I'll just leave it at the defaults of -20 and 20. Those are really very large ranges. That's a plus plus or minus 20 is a 40 milliseconds of delay range. You might want to leave it at plus or minus 10 or even plus or minus 5 if you want to get very picky about that. But for the purpose of this, I'm going to just leave it at its defaults. Okay. So I've got 2 delay blocks. You can't put a delay on the third one because it's all relative delays. So don't try to do the third one. It won't let you do it. Doesn't matter. That's totally normal. Okay. So then now let's go look at some of our config options. So I'm going to go into configuration options, optimization options. First step I'm going to turn in is put this maximize SPL. You'll notice I can't pick these ones yet. That's just because I don't have filters on my shared filter channels yet. We'll get to that in a few minutes. Then I'm going to go to general options. So this is stuff that I typically like to do. First of all, it will default, MSO will default to a certain range. I like to be a bit pickier, and for my case, because I have sealed subs, but they're not really super powerful, I'm not going to try to optimize down here in the 10 hertz range. I think that might get me into trouble. So I'm just going to make this 15 hertz, and this is actually not a null. In fact, I have a peak down at about 8 hertz in my house. As I mentioned, with an open concept basement, the sound actually bounces upstairs and downstairs and creates a weird standing wave. Okay, and then I'll leave the 200 upper limit as it is. That's pretty typical. Usually you go somewhere between 160 and 200 hertz. And this is the range that I'm optimizing the SPL, okay? And when we get to the response in a few minutes, you'll see you actually can control both. In some cases, you might want to reduce the optimized SPL range to something smaller, like 120 or even 80, because the sound pressure is really hard for the subs to generate down in the very low frequencies. By the time you get to 80 or 100, usually most multi-sub situations have plenty of capacity. You don't really need to optimize up in that range. But I'll leave it here for now, because I found actually that generally works just fine. Next up is duration, defaults to 5,180. That's fine. It won't need nearly as many iterations with this very simple run, but we'll leave it at default for now. Okay. You'll note that I can't change the multi-stage options yet because I haven't got that one active. Just hit OK. Okay. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to do a quick run here, and we'll do it live. And so what I want you to look for is when you change the delays on a sub. Let me just show you what happens if I just manually change the delay. Let's say if I want to delay the on the back center sub by 10 milliseconds. I'm just manually typing that in. The back center sub is this blue one. Okay, so when you add delay, it actually shifts the phase downwards. Okay, but it looks like it's shifting the left. You'll see. Okay, but actually, what it's taking is it's taking that blue line and it's sloping it downwards. Okay, and I can just change that to 5. So you can see I could sit here and manually play around with this and pretend I'm doing a manual MSO run, and I could play around with this and see if I get those aligned. Okay, you can also see up above what happens just by randomly selecting a 6 millisecond delay on the back center sub. Look what I've done to my response. I've actually killed my response of my multi-sub system. So even very, very small delays, that's 6/1000ths of a second of delay on one sub, can actually result in that's 5, 10, 15, 20 decibel drop in output. Okay, and this is one of the reasons why many people keep adding subs to their setups. They don't understand DSP or the importance of this, and they don't really like it. They don't get as much output as they think they should be. And it's just because their subs are canceling each other out. You can see right here, I've got 2 subs that are on average 180 degrees apart, and that's exactly what you get when you do that. They cancel each other out. Okay, so I'm just going to zero that back out, and I will start a run on this one here. Okay, so you can see it took only a couple of iterations to get there. You can see it's counting iterations down here. So what's happened? All right, so it's actually much better than it was before. You can see that this gap down here is now maybe 2 or 3 dB. And this one here is getting pretty close to its best it can be. So yes, that's fine. And for the most part, the curve is pretty close. All right. So that's actually pretty good. Most would be quite satisfied with that. You could just be happy with that and then move on. um, without doing anything more. But for the purposes of this tutorial, and actually how I have it set up in my house, is I do like to get as much as I possibly can. I don't have super powerful subs, and well, we all want more power out of our our subwoofers, so it just works better that way. So now that I look down here and I go, well, I can see there's still another almost 2 or 3 dB right here, right where you want it at 40 hertz. And the reason that's not fully aligned, you can see here, the blue and the red subs, which are the two subs up front, sorry, one of the up front subs and my back center sub are aligned quite well. You can see they're parallel with each other, but this black one still is not as lined up. So this is where we'll try some all pass filters. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar with all pass filters effectively allow you to rotate the phase in a configurable way to allow lining up of aligning phase, right? And time aligning any number of different things. It's used in all kinds of ways. But for our purposes, what we want to do, you can see if you look at this black line, what we really want to do is change the slope of the black line. I want to rotate that black line basically with this as the center point and just rotate it down here. Okay. So that's what an all pass filter will allow us to do. So the black line is my front left sub. So I'm going to add an all pass filter. Use the second order all pass filter always. The first order isn't particularly useful. You might get lucky with it, but it's not really that useful. Okay, now you can see it immediately changed the response because there isn't really a zeroed out all pass filter. Now, all pass filters can be dangerous because no matter what you do, every filter is going to impact something about the system. There's no free lunch here. What all pass filters do is they can rotate the phase, but it does come at the cost of a little bit of a delay. That's called group delay, meaning the delay can be different at different frequencies. Okay, and the general rule of thumb is to keep the Q as low as possible. So the lower the Q, the lower the group delay is going to be. So what I recommend is a range between 0.1 and 0.6. Okay, you can get away if you're lucky with a little bit higher than 0.6, but anything higher than 0.8 or 0.9, you're really going to start to introduce material delay in your subwoofer system that can be audible. It can make the bass sound just a little bit loose. This is especially true if you have ported subs. Ported subs already have inherent delay at the lowest frequencies just because of the physical nature of the port. It takes a little bit of time for that sound wave to go back through the port and out. And so adding even more delay can make it can be problematic. But with a subtle amount of twisting, you absolutely can do you can do some pretty magical things here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in an all pass filter here, second order, 0.1 to 0.6. And then one other thing I like to do is I also like to give it a little bit more range of coverage. And this also, if you put a very high number here for its max frequency, what it's doing is it's going to put the center of rotation way off to the right of the screen, up in at the right end. So it'll just be a little subtle amount of rotation in this, and sometimes that can be helpful to align the phase in the upper frequencies, so between 100 and 200 hertz. Other times, if you don't need an all-pass filter there on that sub, it's sort of MSO's way of telling you don't bother putting one there. It's not really going to help you all that much. So what I'm going to try here is just putting in one filter on each of those subs. Okay, so I'm just copying and pasting. I'm just Control-C, Control-V on my keyboard. You can also just copy here and paste just as per normal. Okay. So now I have one on each one, and you can see if you have one on each sub, it goes back to your default. So I'm going to reset all this. And now I'm going to run the optimization again. Okay, so now you can see we're now down to an SPL penalty. I didn't look at the SPL penalty the first time. We're down to 2.65. And you can see now that the blue line and the green lines are almost perfectly on top of each other. There is a bit of a problem right here in this range. Okay, but all the way up to about 100, and then they start to separate a little bit more. Okay, so that's pretty good. And you can see this is what we're starting to look for, right? We now get this nice zigzag pattern on the subwoofers. Okay, so don't worry too much about the little small bumps. That's just some goofy reflections in the room that are causing some minor anomalies in the phase. But that actually sorts itself out in the main run. Okay, but we're getting a pretty good correlation. But there is some cancellation right here. So I'm actually going to just copy those filters. I'll add a second one here and a second one. And sometimes you'll find that one is enough, sometimes two. You can play around with that. But this is why I like to do this step first, because you can kind of lock in on 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 what works best for your setup, and then usually you don't need to change it ever again. Okay, how many AP filters you have. Okay, now I'll just let it run for a little bit longer here. I've got it set to 5,000 and a bit. Okay, and I'm now down to 2.12 dB. So we haven't talked yet about the SPL penalty, but basically, it's really simplistically, the SPL penalty is a measure of the distance between the green line and the blue line across the range that you've set for the optimization. So if you remember, I set the optimization from 15 to 200 hertz. So between here and here, there's kind of, think of it as, you know, a weighted average of 2 dB of penalty. So that's the difference between the maximum theoretical you could get and what you're achieving in this particular optimization run. The SPL penalty will change depending on the numbers of subs you have. So those of you who have many subs, the normal landing spot will be a higher number. It's just the way the math works. So don't worry about that too much. But now we're talking. Okay, so we finished the optimization run. We found one that's like just over 2 dB of penalty. The blue and the green lines are almost on top of each other. Looks great. Little tiny bits of misalignment out here. You can also see, as I mentioned before, just ignore the phase plots. I'll change that in a second here. The phase below 15 hertz. I don't care about that, but I'm getting quite good alignment in the first, chunks of the frequency, and all the way up to 200. Okay, so I think we've got a really good place to start for the next step. Now, as a reminder, MSO will do all of this for you in one pass. So if you do the multi-stage, which we're going to jump to in a second, you don't have to stop here and do it like 16 times like I just did. I just like to play around with it till I get it to where I like it. Okay. I'm just going to have a quick inspection of the filters themselves just to see what we've got. So you can see for this back center sub, there's a filter centered at 28. So that's right here. And it's a very low Q1. So 0.1, that's the lowest that MSO allows you to put in. So that just means it's doing a very subtle twist. And the twist, by the way, it's always rotating clockwise. So what it's doing is at this frequency, 28, it's just taking this blue line and just rotating it clockwise a little bit. And that rotation is the highest right here, and then it gets a little bit less as you go further and further away. Okay. Oh, and by the way, one more thing on the phase plots. This is what's called a wrapped phase, for those of you who are not familiar with them. In reality, this line, this phase line, in reality goes all the way down. It keeps on going down, but it won't fit on the screen. So the standard way to plot phase plots is as soon as it hits, one half cycle, it flips up and starts again. Okay, and so it's just one big long straight line, but they scrunch it down into a nice small range so we can look at it easily. Okay, I'm going to do a quick flip through of the delays. So here you can see we actually have a negative delay on this one. We'll fix that in a second. We don't like negative delays, but MSO can fix that easily. Here's another small negative delay. Okay, that's 48, that's 0.6. So this one here, what this thing on the front left sub, which is the black one, okay, at 49 hertz, right about here, it's rotating it, but 0.6 means it's rotating it even more. Okay, it's a fairly substantial rotation. And that gets the black curve nicely aligned with the blue and the red ones. If you remember from before, they were the ones that were well aligned. The black one was the one that was not alignment. Okay, so one last step before we move to the next one. We're just going to go into I'm right clicking on the subwoofer channels. I'm going to normalize the delays. And once again, you really only need to do this once. I just find it easier to wrap my brain around only having positive delays. And so what it's done is it's taken the delay off of this back center sub and moved it to the other two subs. So that just means that the left and the right front subs are always going to be delayed relative to the back center one. That's sort of the setup here. So you can see now that's a positive number up here, okay? And this is a positive number here. And so one thing I like to do at this point too is now that I know what my sort of normal is, I take out the ability for MSO to make a negative delay by accident. And in fact, I'm going to even change the upper limit, okay, for future runs. And I'm also going to do that right here as well. Okay, so I'm allowing MSO to give some flexibility to the delay in all future runs from this point forward, but I'm never going to allow it to put a negative delay on those ones. And that generally works just fine. For a given setup, there's almost always really only one really good setup of delays and all pass filters that gives you an optimized runs. It's highly repeatable over and over and over again. You'll get generally almost the exact same thing in this first stage. Okay, so in the old ways, in prior MSO 1.0, the process right now would be to either lock these all pass second order filters, or what I used to do is actually I would modify manually the upper and lower bounds to just give it a little bit of wiggle room so that so subsequent steps would not deviate too much from that range. MSO does that for you automatically now. So let's clone this configuration, call it config3, go down here to data view again, turn this on, show the graph, and change the properties. Okay, and let's call this multi-optimization. If I could spell. Okay. Okay, so we now have I'll go back to config view. We now have a new config3. So once again, remember to close your config2, open up config3, and it's copied all your filter settings that you've got in there so far. So now we have an optimized maximum output, okay? But this is clearly not flat. so we want to actually get it flat. So the next step, and you can, like I said before, you can do this all in one step. I'm just showing you how to do it sort of one by one. You add your parametric EQs. So in your shared filters and in your per sub filters, we'll do it in both spots. Okay, so I like to do it shared filters first, and I come over here and have a look. And so in my case, if you remember, I'm going to optimize from about 15 to 200. So I'm just going to make this, I'll make this 16, just one a little bit higher. I'll leave that as 200, that's fine. You can usually leave the defaults as minus 15, that's generally okay. The upper bound of the Q, you definitely don't want to leave it as 25. 25 is a very sharp Q value, and that can cause audible ringing and artifacts if you use that. And the other problem is, well, the other reality is you would never want to have a Q that sharp because you've got multiple seats and multiple subwoofers. So that the law of averaging says you typically don't get very sharp outputs. But you do see this one little sharp spike valley right here on this. This is my right seat. Actually, I know it's my right seat because it's red. And you don't want MSO putting that. So I put in 8.6. That's 1/6 of an octave, if I'm not mistaken. You can use somewhere around 8.6 to 10. 10's fine, I think, in general, but that works pretty well in most cases. But just leave the minimum as Q of 1. And Q, by the way, is the sharpness of your parametric filter. Okay, so a 1 is a very wide, flat, rounded filter. And something like an 8 or a 10 is quite a sharp filter. We'll see that in a few minutes. So I get one of these set up right, okay? And then I highlight over that one and I copy it. I'm hitting Control C on my keyboard and then Control V, and I'm going to put 10 of them total. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, I have a mini DSP, so there's 10 on my input. I don't use BEQ. But you always want to have the max of these ones on the shared filters. Okay, that's going to get you the main curve shape that you want to get. Okay, and so for whatever your DSP is, you want to max out your shared or input filters as much as possible. And then what I'll do, one more thing, is I'll just copy this guy here, and then I'll put a filter in my per sub filters. Okay, I've got 3 of these to do. And so, excuse me, these ones, I'm going to make a little change here. So you can leave the bottom end as is, And then I'm going to change this to -6. It doesn't really matter that much because the new SPL penalty limit will actually control how deep of a cut these will make. But I do find that just maybe my habit of previous versions of MSO, this works quite well. Okay. And generally you don't need too many of these. Okay. So this is really dependent on your personal preferences and your setup. So I'm just going to put in 3 for the time being. And you know what, just to make things faster on the optimization, I'm going to remove a bunch of my shared filters. And I'll put them back in at the end when we're doing our kind of final polish one. So I just, once again, I copied that using Control C on my keyboard and pasted them in. Okay, so you can see I've got 3 on each of my subwoofers. So these are called per sub filters. And what these ones do is these ones help improve your seat to seat variation. And what you'll find is they almost always only make adjustments in what's called the modal region, or sort of typically in most normal size rooms, it's somewhere between 50 hertz and up. You'll start to see there's quite an advantage of having different EQ on different subwoofers in that range. It'll smooth out the performance in that area. Below that area, typically that's below the first mode in your room or in the first modes of your room, and actually, you almost don't really need that. You can see even right now, on my couch, the the performance and the measurements are very, very close to each other. Now, if you've got multiple rows or an unusual subwoofer setup, you can see definitely some bigger variances over here, and I see that in many other setups that I've helped optimize. Okay, so I'll just do a quick save of that. Now, we need to make a few other changes here on my optimization options. So first one is I want to change to multi-stage. Okay, like I said, you can go straight to multi-stage right from the start. Don't do this step, just go straight to here. And MSO will automatically do this step as the first stage, and you'll see that in a minute. Okay, now I'll go to general options. Now you can see, now that I've changed that, this option is now available. So I'm going to change that to 15, just like the other one, and I'll leave that. So that means it's going to optimize for flatness between here at 15 hertz and here at 200 hertz. Okay, I'll leave my fixed reference level of 77.5. Oh, I just realized I forgot to do one other thing. So on my shared filters, I need to add a gain block. Okay, now this is really important. The gain block is useful because what it allows MSO to do is have a little bit of variation in its actual target. So I've set it to 77.5. But there might be a slightly better solution at 79 hertz or at 71 hertz. And MSO, you want to give it a bit of variability. The problem is if you do a default gain block here, you'll notice it's giving me plus or minus 15 dB. That's way too much, in my opinion. So that's where people run into problems where they get it all done, looks awesome, and then they load it up into their mini DSP and their sub level's way too low. Okay. Or too high for that matter, but it's usually too low. So I like to give it a plus or minus 5. So what that means is I'm basically telling MSO, I think the target should be 77.5, but you can go as high as 82.5 or as low as 72.5, and it'll automatically adjust for that. Okay, so that works quite nicely. Okay, I'm going to go now back into the optimization options. Okay, so where were we? We're at general options, so everything else is fine. Durations for single stage is no longer applicable. We're now in multi-stage options. So let's talk about this parameter here. This is probably your most important parameter to mess around with other than just your counts of filters and that sort of thing. So this is your allowable SPL penalty. Okay, so what this parameter does is, if you remember, when we did our first run, we had a native SPL penalty of 2.07. Here it is down in the lower left corner. Conveniently left there for me to explain. So that meant that it's basically a measure of how far you are from the absolute max you could ever do. So if you have 1 here, it means it'll allow MSO to reduce that by as much as 1 more. So that would allow the penalty to go up to 3.07. Okay. I personally, in my setup, I don't like to have that high of a number. I like to keep it pretty low. Okay, because once again, I don't have massive subs, and so to me, output is more important than perfect seat to seat. But your situation might be different. You might have multiple rows. You might like to have lots of people there at the same time. Lots of good reasons to go a higher number. This is something you can play around with depending on what the results are. Okay, so I'm going to set that to 0.2. And then durations, I'm going to change this to 1000 because it finds it very quickly in this setup. Okay, and just for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to change these to 5000 so it goes through pretty quickly. Okay, so that's those settings. So this is really how many iterations it's going to do, and now it's going to do three different stages. First, it's going to maximize the SPL just like we just did. Then it's going to minimize the seat-to-seat variation, okay, and simultaneously try to get it close to that target. And once it's done 5,000 iterations of that, it'll go to the last stage, which is lock in all the seat-to-seat variation and then try to get your main listening position absolutely as close to that target as it possibly can. You'll see that in a minute. Okay, so sub general PEQ limits. So these limits here used to be more important prior to MSO 2.0. If you have a reasonable number in your penalty here, okay, somewhere between 0.2 and 1, I don't think you need to worry about these. You can just leave them wide open. Just leave them empty. Don't put any limits there. So what these limits are doing is the first one here is your would be your output PEQ limits. This would be limiting these output parametric EQs from stacking on top of each other. Okay, so if I were to say I don't want any stacking more than 6 dB, that would mean that if I had two PEQ2s really close to each other, they would not be able to do more than 6 dB of cut. The reason you don't need to worry about that too more is because the SPL penalty limit is actually going to prevent that from happening, or it'll prevent it from happening to extreme degrees, which it used to do quite a bit in previous versions of MSO. Same thing for the input PEQ. This is a little bit of a different thing. I also just don't bother with modifying this one here because I have a very tight tolerance in my gain block here. So what this limit is my shared PEQs. Okay, so that's how much my total amount of cut can be. Okay, so you could get like a 60 dB cut if you had a whole bunch of things stacked on top of each other. But as long as you have reasonable targets, so you can see my target right here is 77. So the most I need to cut to get to 77 is from about here. So that's 5, 10, 15, 20, about 22. 22 is fine. I'm not worried about 22 dB of cut. And so I'll just let MSO figure out what it needs to do. So everything else you can just leave it default. You can play around with target curves if you want. I don't bother with the group weights. It seems to work just fine without it. Okay, so here we go. We're all set, ready to go, and we'll do an optimization run. Actually, let me just stop that. I'm going to reset it so we can kind of watch the whole run. Okay, so I've reset everything. We're back to the start. Now this is what I meant before, where you don't have to do that first step that I did. You can do it all in one step. It's now going to redo that step. Just let it do its thing. I'm going to pause for a few minutes while it's optimizing. Okay, so you can see it's now moved to the second stage. So now, as I mentioned before, MSO is now optimizing the seat-to-seat variation. Okay, so you can see I've set it to 5,000 iterations, so it's almost done. So what it's trying to do is it's using all its available flexibility to tighten up the seat-to-seat variation. Now let's talk a little bit about this line right here that I haven't mentioned before. So this line right here is the filter channels. So this is what each PEQ filter is actually doing in amplitude response. So you can see there's actually 3 lines here. You can't see them all. You can see right here there's actually a separation of one of the lines. So all 3 subs are getting reduced by about the same amount almost the whole way through, except for in a few areas. You can see that one of the subs, here it's the back center sub, here it's the front left sub, over here it's the front right sub, are getting a little bit of extra. And that's enabling an improvement on seat-to-seat variation. Now I've got a very tight tolerance on seat-to-seat, so you can see there's not a lot of per sub PEQ that's actually happening here. Okay, So it's actually done the entire run of optimization. You can see I only gave it 5,000 iterations, so it hasn't found an amazingly flat response. And normally I get a significantly better response than this in a full run. I'll do that in a second. But basically it's done. So you now have, I've got 5 PEQs here. I can see on the gain block, I like to inspect here the gain block. It went up by 1.8. Okay, so you can see actually the filter channels, if there was no gain, those filter channels would max out at right on that line, but they actually max out 1.8 higher. So that's fine. That's no worries whatsoever. You can also see it's barely using the per sub filters at all. Okay, so it's not, but that's resulting in a fairly high seat to seat variation. So I'm going to do one more iteration here. I'm going to turn up the SPL penalty parameter and I'll run it for longer. I'll pause and come back and we'll see where we get to. Okay, so I'll show you how I'm doing that. So first of all, I'm going to go back to optimization options. Multi-stage options, I'm going to change this to 1. Okay, so I'll allow a fair amount of fair amount of SPL penalty. I'm going to change my durations. I'll set this to let's set this to 20,000. You have to play around with these numbers a little bit until you sort of get a sense for how long it takes with your particular PC and your setup and how many subs. Typically, the more subs and the more PEQ, it does tend to go up exponentially. Okay, and then I'm going to actually put back in those other 5 PEQ filters that I had there before. Let me just reset these first. Okay, I'll do a quick save. I'm going to copy a blank filter 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'll just add one more PEQ here. Oops. I think I put one too many here. Yeah, I did. There we go. Okay, so I've got 4 outputs there. I've got a much longer run. So I'm going to start the run again with a bit changed setting, and I'll pause it through the run, and I'll come back when it's done. Okay, we're right in the middle of the second stage here where it's optimizing the seat to seat. I just want to point out something different than the first run. You can see now the seat to seat's a little tighter cluster between here and here. Okay, but you can also see the filter channels, and it's a little messy. Everything's on top of each other, but the filter channels are now quite different between each of the different subs. So here you can see the red and the blue sub are more or less the same filters, but I'm taking the MSO is taking quite a bit off of the that's the front left sub at 54 hertz. Oops, changed a little bit to try to get this seat to seat, presumably in this area here, a little tighter. Okay, and this is one of the reasons why the SPLP parameter matters so much, because when you remove, you're basically turning the volume down on this sub at 54 hertz. That's effectively what it's doing, but just between here and here, between 45 and 65 hertz, you're just turning that volume down by, that's almost 10 dBs down. That's half the volume. And so what that does mean is these 2 other subs have to take all of that capacity on their own. You don't get the advantage of having 3 subs working together. You only get really 2 and a bit, right? And so you've lost some of your maximum output capability because you're turning down the volume locally. So it works really well to get the seat to seat variation nice and tight. However, you do have a penalty of losing your output. And so that's the beauty of the new parameter in MSO2, is that you can strike the right balance by messing around with that number. So if you remember, I changed it to 1. Originally I had it at 0.2. That was quite aggressive. I was like, just get it as powerful as I can. I didn't really like the response, so I upped it to 1. And I think in reality, I would prefer it somewhere probably in between those two, maybe at 0.3, maybe at 0.5. So that's where you can really play around with it. Okay. One other thing I'll note here is you'll see that I haven't mentioned this before. We'll just talk a little bit about it again. So on the excuse me, on the phase plots, what you want to look for is this sort of nice sort of zigzag pattern or seesaw pattern. And you also want to see the lines as close to each other, clustered together as possible. The other thing that you want to watch out for is a change in the steepness of these lines that's quite significant. So this is pretty common if you put in an all-pass filter that has a very high Q, not even a very high Q, even a Q of 1 or 1.5 or 2, which is not super high. What it does is it rotates the phase so much that you get that you'll see this line go steeply down and then flat again, or the space between sort of the wrap lines gets tighter and tighter. What that actually is telling you and how to interpret that is you're actually getting group delay in that area. Okay, the slope of the phase line is a representation of the delay at that frequency. And so it's generally good to have as shallow and as consistent phase lines as possible. So a shallow slope, so it's not going down too quickly, means you have lower group delay. A steeper slope means you have higher group delay. And there's all kinds of debates as to what the right number is in terms of group delay, and you can plot that in RumeEQ Wizard directly after you finish your measurements. It's not a bad idea to do it just to make sure you haven't done something untoward. But you typically want to keep it underneath 1 or maybe 1.5 cycles at that frequency, which means the limit varies by frequency. So if I'm not mistaken, yeah, at 50 hertz, 1 cycle is 1 over 50 hertz. That's 0.02 seconds. Okay, so that's 20 milliseconds to make it a bit more reasonable to calculate in your head. Okay, and at 20 hertz, it's 1 over 20 hertz, so that is 50 milliseconds. Okay, that's the limit that you would want to have typically. Okay, so we're now in the final stage. So we're almost getting done here, and we're really polishing things off. You can see we now have what MSO is now doing is it's trying to get the blue line as tight to the target as it possibly can. Okay, and you can see it's doing an excellent job. This is a really, really, really good response. Just ignore this part down here. Remember, I'm not going to bother with that. I'm not even sure I trust that number, to be honest. You might they lose accuracy below 10 hertz. Even below 15 hertz, they're not super accurate. Okay, so this is looking really, really good. I think I will stop it there. And maybe one last thing, a couple things we'll look at here. So one, quick inspection. I'll look at the delay blocks just to make sure they look reasonable. That's 5. That's a really good delay number here. Almost exactly the same number on this other sub. You can inspect the PEQs if you want. This is where you go and export them into your mini DSP, or any other DSP that you have. So I'm not going to show you how to do that here in this video, but that's the step you do. And then just a quick summary here. It's worth looking at the performance metrics. So there's a nice handy new dialog that has performance metrics for all, that summarizes all of your performance metrics. So the ones that you typically want to look for are in this upper left-hand corner. So the first one is your seat-to-seat variance. The second one is your main listening position flatness. And the third one is your SPL penalty. Okay. So if you remember in my config 2, when I was just testing let me start with the baseline. My baseline with doing nothing had an SPL penalty of 6. Now that's quite problematic. If you remember when I looked, the baseline had a dip in the middle and some problems in the 18, 19 hertz range. Okay. Had quite a high seat-to-seat and terrible MLP flatness, all right? So no surprise, that's what everyone has when they first start. We did, let's just try to maximize our SPL, and you can see we actually got it to 2.07. That's about the best we could do using a mixture of delays and all-pass filters. And then we did one more run here, which we could have done all in one run. With a few iterations, you can start it again. It's easy to do. You saw me stopping and then resetting and starting, making a few adjustments and starting again. The SPLP penalty, remember I set the limit I allowed it to go up to 1 dB higher than this. So it went to 3.04. Okay, and it got my MLP flatness. You can see visually it's excellent, right? I mean, that's another reason why I like to put this target halfway between 80 and 75, is I know that this is plus or minus 2.5 dB. And this is even, all my seats are almost all plus or minus 2.5 dB, all the way from 15 hertz to, almost 160. Like that's really, really excellent. Um, now I'm just measuring on my couch. I've just got a couch in my room. Um, and the last thing I'll say is the seat-to-seat variation is quite low as well. Okay, and so you can, as I mentioned, you can play around with the different parameters. Once again, if you allow more SPL penalty, you will reduce your seat-to-seat variation. It will make no difference whatsoever to the MLP flatness. Okay, you're always MSO is always going to try to get your MLP flat as the last step. Okay, so you're really playing off your output, your maximum output, against your seat-to-seat. So you can pick which one you think is more important. And then I'll leave you the last thing is just remember to have a quick look at your phase plots down here. What you want to look for is that you typically would see, actually, it depends on if you've got ported subs or sealed subs. The normal for sealed subs is you would see a shallow slope here and would get a little steeper and a little steeper and a little steeper. And you might see 2 or 3 kind of zigzags between your typical subwoofer range, right? That's a normal behavior for sealed subs. If you have ported subs, you typically will see down in the lower range where the port tuning is, you'll see a fairly steep phase line, okay, that might go from here to here. And then you'll see a shallower one where it's getting into more like a sealed behavior. And then you'll start to see a steepening of the phase lines, okay? You always want to see the phase lines on top of each other, but MSO will take care of that for you automatically if you use the multi-stage one. I didn't really talk too much about these low frequencies. You can just those, depends on what the setup is. A lot of times if I'm not that interested, I'll just change my axes to be like 15 and just hide it so I don't have to see it. It doesn't make much difference. Yeah, don't worry too much about little bumps and tweaks and stuff like that. That's pretty normal. You can see this red line right here where you've got a wrap line in an unusual spot. That's usually a sign that that subwoofer has, there's just a local minima on that one. Basically, you've got a little cancellation on that front right sub just at that frequency. Okay, but that's only at the one listening position, so don't worry about that either. You're just looking for the overall trending of these. Okay, and you can upload these into your system. And then just last reminder, the normal process is you get it as flat as you can, you load it up into your AVR, and then you run your Odyssey, your anthem room correction, your YPOW, whatever happens to be that you use in post, and you presented only one subwoofer. Okay, you just tell it I've got one sub, and you'll see if you've got the charts for that setup, it should show you quite a flat response, and you let it do its thing. Okay, and then if you want a room curve or any other tweaks like that, it's generally better to do that in the AVR, assuming you've got the ability to do that. I use dynamic room correction on mine. I've got an Anthem on my setup, so I use dynamic room correction, so it automatically changes the room curve depending on the volume I'm setting. And you can also force that into here, or you can build other shelving filters and other things in your mini DSP if you don't have a normal AVR, if you're using a streamer or a laptop or something like that. There's other ways to get your room curve. But this is general best practice. Get it flat here and then do sort of post-processing to get your room curve that you want. Okay, hopefully that helps everyone, and thanks.